Hello folks, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at another one of Abraham Merritt's, he published under the name A. Merritt, books that we've looked at. We've already looked at The Moon Pool. We looked at actually both the short story and the novel that took the short story and kind of used it as kind of the first part of a novel itself and so forth in a previous review. For you, those of you who may not know who A. Merritt is, he's a writer who's writing in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and so forth. He's big into writing a lot of the sort of lost world sort of stuff. He has a lot of stuff that's very influential on fantasy during the time. We'll be taking a look at some of his classic works. Probably his best well-known work today is The Ship of Ishtar, which we'll be looking at in a later video. But today I was kind of in this adventure, lost world fun mode, so I decided to do another one of these. I'd already done a trilogy of reviews for you. I had taken a look at some stuff by Arthur C. Clarke, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and The Lost World, first book by The Moon Pool of A. Merritt, and that's his first book, and also his first Lost World stuff. But he does a lot of this sort of adventure stuff. And we'll take a look at this book, Dwellers in the Mirage. This was actually the first book I read by Abraham Merritt. I read it when I was a kid from my local library, and this edition of this book is just, I mean, it's just incredibly old and so forth. I mean, you can just smell it. This particular book is an Avon book. It was published in the 60s. It was a republish of the book. So this book itself is still more than probably 50 years old. But I picked it up when I was in the library reading it. This is not my copy of it. I picked it up later. But I did, in fact, get a chance to read it when I was a kid, and I enjoyed it at the time, and so forth. That's probably about 10 or 11 at the time. And I read it from my local library in Boone County, West Virginia. So let's take a look. As a reminder, A. Merritt is a writer who's writing a lot of different things. Particularly, he likes to write fantasy and horror are definitely his kind of bread and butter. Particularly, he loves these sort of adventure stories as opposed to more of a traditional horror. He's more of an adventure horror. I've talked before in my previous review about a short story he did that was horror called The Moon Pool that put him on the map. Before that, he was just writing some smaller stuff and lesser well known, but that short story put him on the map in a major way, as it's set in the ruins of Namadol over in the Atlantic Ocean nation of Micronesia on the island of Pohnpei. So it's on that island. It's an artificial island. These ruins are out there, and this is a time when archaeology and discovery and so forth is big in the media, so it's also big in the written world. So you have a lot of people talking about it in the written word, like Arthur Conan Doyle is the one who sort of creates this sort of Lost World storyline, but adventuring has been a thing for a while. Haggard probably started it with King Solomon's Mines, but it's been continuing and ongoing. And this sort of adventure, going places, exploring things, finding ruins, finding people, and so forth. And some people will be writing it more of as a horror story. H.P. Lovecraft has explorers and archaeologists who are running into dark and unknown crypts that should better, and secrets that should better be left forgotten. But lots of writers are using this sort of adventuring, exploring, going into ruins, archaeology as a sort, and exploring as a sort of the starting of their stories, and everything from At the Mountains of Madness, which is a Lovecraft story where people are doing an expedition down to the South Pole, all the way to Dwellers in the Mirage by Merritt is also something that has this sort of feel to it. So in this story, we have somebody who's exploring Alaska. His name is Liefson. He's this American person who's exploring the area. He comes across this unusually warm valley, and there's where your sort of Lost World sort of concepts will begin, as many of these Lost World concepts are sort of hidden valleys, lost islands, plateaus that have been forgotten, where there are these things that are still alive. And in this case, there's more fantasy than there is Lost World, and sort of a traditional adventure. In this case, while there will be some sort of lost concepts, tribes that'll come across and so forth, there's a lot more magic here. There's been this dark octopus entity, which I actually see here on the cover, which has a name very similar to Cthulhu, actually. And then he has, this has been summoned from another plane to have some human sacrifices to give it power. That's sort of traditional tropes during the pulp era, so it's not surprising that you would have human sacrifices here and so forth. You'll see that in everything from fantasy
fantasy of like, Robert E. Howard's Conan stuff to H.P. Lovecraft in the Cthulhu mythos and so forth and more. So that is not something that would be unusual during this era, the human sacrifice context. But they're going to be sacrificing humans in order to give this dark octopus entity from another plane or another dimension, give it more power and so forth. And thus, when they do so, they'll be rewarded with their own dark powers, which is very Cthulhu mythos at the time. It's not a Cthulhu mythos story. This is a Cthulhu rising from the darks or those sorts of creatures or characters, but you get the idea. It's it still has that sort of a concept. But instead of it being tied to sort of a traditional horror story or even a traditional science fiction story, instead it's kind of tethered to more of the trappings of a Lost World story, which has typically you're going to find in a Lost World story, and you'll also find it here too. This sort of an adventuring trope where we're exploring, trying to find out what's going on, and so forth. And that's happening here too. So you're also having you're having your main character explore and so forth. He finds out that he's actually the people here, the local tribesmen recognize him as this lost hero, which plays into that sort of overarching theme myth of the Thera, the forgotten one that's coming back, the predicted one, the one who's been prophesized to save them, and so forth. And you are actually that person. That sort of trope from myth and so forth is definitely in play here too. And so Lief will find himself actually being possessed by that person and so forth. They'll have to deal with that. So that's also a part of the storyline too, him coming to grips with his destiny and such. And then ultimately trying to overthrow this dark octopus entity from, again, another dimension. So that's basically the main crux of the story. It is something that feels very Dungeons & Dragons-ish, very proto-Dungeons & Dragons. And there's a reason for that. It's actually on Gary Gygax's Appendix N. For short, Gary Gygax is a person who created Dungeons & Dragons, and he uses a lot of this sort of pulp era in places like Dwellers in the Mirage and the writer A. Merritt, among others, as inspiration for a lot of the stuff that he brings into Dungeons & Dragons. And through a lot of modern fantasy gaming, from both board gaming and role-playing games, video games and such, as well as other other sorts of visual media like videos, TV shows, movies, comics, and so forth, books, short stories, whatever, and all that sort of stuff was very heavily influenced by Gygax's. And he tells us what his major sort of inspirations are in Appendix N of his first Dungeons & Masters guide. And so if you look at that, you can see where a lot of these sort of major works of inspiration come from for a lot of the things that are popular in modern fantasy. And this book is actually listed by name. And this idea of adventuring, exploring, and so forth is definitely something that is definitely a trope that Merritt loves, and he really has tapped into. And he uses it in most of his books. I think The Ship of Ishtar is probably the only example of a book I've ever read that doesn't have this sort of adventuring, exploring concept. That's happening here too. The valley in Alaska that's suddenly warm, that has these lost tribes and these lost plants and all these other things too, and creatures and characters and animals, and fighting against these lost dark creatures that have this magic and so forth. It definitely feels like a modern fantasy sort of a setting. Now, it doesn't have some of the modern fantasy trappings. A. Merritt is not a particularly avant-garde writer when it comes to writing women or anything like that. The women are going to be typical pulp women. They're more of trappings and so forth. In the original publishing of this story in 1932, the woman at the end will die. A later version of the book will not have it. The first version, like a lot of the novels during this time, it's actually serialized in magazine form first. That version, the woman dies, the love interest dies. Then when it was published as a book later on that year in 32, she will actually be saved at the end and won't die. So depending on which version you're reading, which version has come together, the ending may change a little bit. But it's fine. I mean, it's not a key part of the story. I prefer the more tragic ending, because I think it's the original ending, and I prefer the original ending of an author and their vision rather than a publisher, making it a bit of a downer, and so forth. But just so you know, go and eyes wide open, depending on what version of the story you'll have, will depend on the ultimate result of the main woman love interest in the story. Anyway, that's the story by Dwellers in the Mirage by A. Merritt. Have you read anything else by A. Merritt? Have you read this book? Do you agree or disagree with my thoughts? I'd love to talk with you more in detail. If you have any things you want to talk about from the book itself, specific passages, or whatever. I'll give you a link below to the book itself in case you want to pick it up. and read it. It was published in 32, but there's still a copyright on it. A lot of things that were published then don't have copyrights anymore, but I think this one does. So I'm going to be linking you to an Amazon so you can just purchase it, rather than like a Project Gutenberg or something like that where you can just go read it for free. So I'll link you to where you can actually just purchase it. But it's pretty cheap on the secondary market and such. Again, because it has, but it's a proto dungeon field and a crawler, kind of a explorer dungeon crawler feel, except in a kind of a lost world. So it feels a little bit more like, you know, an adventure more like the Isle of Dread from Dungeons and Dragons, set on an island of dinosaurs and such, or something like that, than it does from you know, more of a traditional sort of an adventure style of writing. So it's a good story. I enjoyed it. I've read it twice now. Again, once when I was a kid, and again probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I do enjoy it a lot. I think it's really good. But again, A. Merritt is a person who's writing of a time. He's not this avant-garde writer like a Jack London might be, or something like that. He's definitely a person who's writing in his time, and his language and his use of females, characters, or lack thereof, and kind of how they're just more of just a superficial trope rather than being fleshed out and interesting, is definitely a product of his time too, just going in. And that's true of any Merritt story that you're going to go in and read. Even The Ship of Ishtar, which has a major female character in it, kind of breaks some of those tropes. She's still tropish. We'll talk about that though later when I do my review of The Ship of Ishtar. But thanks very much for watching this video. It's been almost about 10 minutes or so. If you've spent that much time watching this video, hey, I really appreciate it, that you took some time out of your day, invested in my video, and so forth. If you like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button, because there's going to be so many more reviews and such to follow. I try to do a lot of unpacking of these classics of fantasy and science fiction and horror for you. So thanks again for your time. You have a great day.